Good afternoon, fellow esteemed colleagues, distinguished guests, and visionary leaders who are gathered here for the Doha Forum. My name is Sharif Banna. I am the chairman of Jagaron Foundation, which is a think tank committed to advancing reform and democratic governance and human rights in Bangladesh. Today, we are convened in this gracious, beloved, beautiful country at the invitation of the Doha Forum to engage in a critical discussion entitled Bangladesh at a Crossroads: Governance, Democratic Reform, and the Path Forward Post Sheikh Hasina. We meet at a pivotal moment in the history of Bangladesh where Sheikh Hasina's recent and abrupt departure from Bangladesh as Prime Minister marked the end of a 15-year rule. The catalyst for this profound shift was a dramatic student led uprising reacting to the accumulation of systemic issues under the Hasina regime. These issues included grievances over the public sector jobs, quotas, police brutality, reaching a tipping point, culminating in the tragic events where approximately 1,500 people lost their lives in the protests and over 20,000 people are injured. Soon after Hasina's departure from Bangladesh, the Nobel laureate Professor Dr. Muhammad Yunus was officially sworn in as the head of Bangladesh's interim government. His appointment bolsters hope for reform and a democratic change in Bangladesh for the first time in over 15 years. Some even label this historic moment in history as the second independence. First independence being in 1971, and the second being on the 5th of August, or known as July 36, right? 6 more days added to the month of July. As Bangladesh stands at this crossroad, the decisions that the government, the people, civil society, the international community will critically shape the nation's governance landscape. Today's session will explore how Bangladesh can navigate those complexities of transition to reinforce the foundations of a truly inclusive and transparent governance. Our gathering underscores the power of collective insight and international cooperation. We have present today thought leaders, policymakers, activists, academics, endowed with different perspectives on democratic processes, human rights, and governance. Each panelist will offer a unique insight into leveraging and highlighting their perspective on the transitional period to hopefully strengthen democratic institutions, safeguard human rights, and ensure equitable economic development. Additionally, we recognize the role of the Bangladeshi youth and the students of Bangladesh, whose aspiration and activism and sacrifice have been instrumental in driving this change. Their continued engagement in the political, democratic, civic process is essential for the sustainability of the democratic transition. The support of the international community remains indispensable. Our global partners play a critical role in supporting Bangladesh through this transition. Before we move on to our esteemed panelists, we are grateful to have a special pre recorded video message for Doha Forum from the head of the Bangladeshi government, the chief advisor of Bangladesh, Professor Muhammad Yunus.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, the Doha Forum is an important platform for fostering dialogue and advancing collective solutions to the world's most pressing challenges. I thank His Highness Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, the Emir of the State of Qatar, for inviting me to address this esteemed gathering at the 22nd Doha Forum. The world is struggling with overlapping crises, disproportionately impacting their developing nations. Challenges such as the aftermath of the COVID 19 pandemic, climate change, economic stagnation, mounting debt, inflation, and the widening digital divide are deepening inequalities between the global north and the south. At the same time, unresolved disputes and conflicts perpetuate suffering and destabilize communities, particularly in the global south. Excellencies, Bangladesh has recently undergone a profound transformation. In this July and August, a youth led uprising initially aimed at ending discrimination progressively evolved into a nationwide people's movement against autocracy, discrimination, oppression, and corruption. They also fought for liberalism, secularism, democracy, and justice. The people aspired for a just, inclusive, and functioning democracy, for which our new generations made their supreme sacrifice. This new chapter in Bangladesh inspires hope, not just for our people, but for all who aspire to freedom and dignity. We were moved by the wisdom, courage, and conviction showed by our youth. The power of the ordinary people, in particular our youth, presented to our nation an opportunity to overhaul many of our systems and institutions. In order to restore people's trust and confidence, and to ensure that tragic past never recur in future of Bangladesh, we have initiated reforms in certain prioritized sectors. We launched independent commissions to reform electoral system, constitution, judicial system, civil administration, and law and order sectors. We have rolled out extensive reforms in banking and financial sectors in order to create a conducive environment for business. We will not let any foreign business interests to be affected. I would therefore call on the international community to continue and deepen engagements with Bangladesh and come to Bangladesh with new investments. Excellencies, we have witnessed unprecedented aggression and flagrant violations of international law in Gaza against civilians, especially women and children. The deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, hospitals, humanitarian convoys, and aid workers has devastated lives and reduced once thriving civilization of Gaza to rubble. Escalating conflicts in the Rakhine state have rendered the Rohingyas vulnerable to mass atrocities. Bangladesh currently hosts 1.2 million displaced Rohingyas, with over 32,000 children born in the camps annually. In recent months, another 50,000 entered Bangladesh, and they continue to cross border every month. Bangladesh remains committed to upholding the rights, dignity, and security of Rohingya people. But the socioeconomic and environmental cost of hosting the Rohingyas are becoming unbearable for Bangladesh. This crisis poses significant traditional and non traditional security risks, threatening our development gains. Despite repeated calls from the international community, Myanmar has failed to create conducive environment for dignified, safe, and sustainable return of the Rohingyas. We urge the global community to intensify efforts for a political solution to this protracted problem. We maintain that repatriation is the only sustainable solution to this crisis. Excellencies, as we confront this polycrisis, we must reimagine our approach to global cooperation by setting global priorities. After a decade of commitment to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, only 24% of SDGs have been achieved. This shortfall reflects not just gaps in resources, but also an erosion of trust and confidence in global systems and institutions. South South and triangular cooperation offer unique avenues for countries to address shared challenges, leveraging the energy and innovation of the youth. By uniting the global South, we can unlock transformative solutions for a sustainable future. Climate change poses threats to all of us. What we need is climate justice. So the irresponsible choices or indifferent actions or harms caused are accounted for. We need access to life saving technologies, particularly in agriculture, water, and public health. where modest solutions or innovations can save millions of vulnerable people. Excellencies, to restore faith and shared responsibility, we must embrace bold foundational principles. My vision of three zeros: zero poverty, zero unemployment, and zero carbon emissions align with these imperatives. These goals require collective action, transcending borders and building coalitions among vulnerable nations. Excellencies, I look forward to deepening our collaboration with the Doha Forum and wish the 22nd edition resounding success. I thank you.
Thank you to the chief advisor and the of Bangladesh, Professor Mohammed Yunus, and also to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Bangladesh, who quite tirelessly and diligently were able to secure this video um, despite many technical issues. We saw that the chief advisor referred to the role and the aspiration and the hope of the youth, and that's what I'd like to begin our session here today. Um, we have with us Sajid. Sajid Mahmood is an international relations student at Dhaka University. He's also a deputy coordinator of the student uprising, and this uprising, which led to the downfall, the departure of the previous Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina. Sajid, we are all as citizens who love freedom, equality, equity. We're all proud of this historic moment. Can you perhaps share with us as to why you were involved in the student movement and what are your hopes for the future for Bangladesh?
Okay, thank you so much. So there's a very generic perception about the movement or the July uprising that we just wanted to have a fall of the dictator Hasina regime. But there are some deep-rooted and more analytical causes behind this uprising or the movement. So the reasons are so many, and you see, we just didn't want to the fall of the Hasina regime, but we want a total reformation of the whole system. Because you see, if you don't reform the system, then the fascist will come again and again. So we wanted a reformation. If you look towards the last 15 years and 16 years, the situation and scenario in Bangladesh, you will see that people could not even talk about anything. There were acts like the Digital Security Act. You cannot talk about anything. You cannot criticize the government. There were the criminal student-led organizations of the government, the Chhatro League. They would have beaten up to the death in different campuses or in the capital city. There were economic inequalities. People were not getting jobs, and you see the quota reformation system. Um, Let me mention you one thing. This movement or this uprising would not have been would not have been to the peak if there were, I mean, there were if there were not the very derogatory words or terms for the students who were actually doing a movement against the quota system, which is a very discriminatory system in the world. So the previous dictator, once in her press conferences, termed the students who were having the movement as Razakars. You know, Razakar is a very derogatory and humiliating term and words for everyone for Bangladeshis, because Razakars were the people who were the war criminals back in 1971. And when students started the movement against the discrimination or the discriminatory processes of the quota movement. So the dictator and the fascist regime termed the students as Razakars. So after that, this movement went to the peak, and we wanted a total reformation about the whole system. And if we want to talk about the whole scenario, there are so many things that were eventually devastating the lifestyle, the situation, the freedom of opinion, freedom of everything in Bangladesh. So yeah, students got into the road and fought against the fascist regime. Yeah.
Just to clarify, so the fascist regime here is referring, it's a term that the student movement and the civil society use to describe the last 15 years of rule in Bangladesh. So just for clarity, I know we're speaking in languages that is internal to Bangladesh, but we need to explain some terms in the global space as well. I'd like to move on to Professor Munir Khosru, who is the founder of a pioneering Bangladesh-based think tank, the IPAG. Um, You are recognized for your broad expertise in promoting global public policy and advocacy. Bangladesh, though in recent history we witness a significant and transformative economic growth, especially prior to COVID. However, since Hasina's departure, we see many economic challenges. What are the main issues impacting Bangladesh's economy today?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thanks, Sharif and Tuha Forum and Jagan Foundation for having kindly invited. Before I answer your question, he reminds me of 1991. At that time, I was a student. I was the head of Dhaka University Debating Club. And I remember the fall of the military dictator at that time, General Ershad. And we were dancing in the street, very rightly imbued with a new aspiration. The great job the students have done, which we failed to do, they put their chest in the line of fire. I would just hope they do not lose 3 decades that we did and where we stand today. So I would tend to caution that we Bangladeshis are very emotional. We tend to swing from one end to the another. We need to find more measured, nuanced approach to deal with crisis. This is me to you, one generation to another. Don't go through the same thing that we did. Don't end up in 2050 looking back and thinking whether it was worth doing it. With that note of caution, optimism, I will start. Secondly, too many lives have gone. You could have been not with us. You could have been one of those who could have taken the bullet. The fact you're here is a testament God has bigger thing destined for you. Don't waste it. Moving on to the question. Well, economy, to be honest, I'm not one of those who take extreme position. As much mismanagement, corruption signified the previous regime led by deposed Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. The fact also remains we have had some good economic indicators. Our per capita income was $900, which jumped to $2,500, and our SDG, some of them has been well done. What I'm trying to say, let's remove the economic angle. The mismanagement corruption that has happened, which is mind-boggling now as it's coming out the picture. I mean, we have 1.5 trillion taka of non-performing loans. We have 10 banks struggling to survive. We have serious issues of corruption where apparently the reports suggest that billions of dollars have left the country. So definitely there has been severe mismanagement, corruption, and I hope the interim government finds a way to recover this money. Now, coming to immediate economic challenges, first and foremost, end of the day, as elections around the world shows, if people are not being able to put food in the table, that takes away everything. Look at what has happened in US, look at what happened in other countries. So inflation currently is running more than 11%, food inflation is more than 13%, and people are struggling to put food on the table. And the ordinary people, as much as they love and respect what the students have done, end of the day, must meet their minimum basic requirement. So, in my opinion, the caretaker government with a lot of good intent, a lot of well-respected people in the cabinet, somehow has not been able to address it properly. Number two, investor confidence. In such a situation where there are mixed signals, it will be difficult to get investment. And many of the reform measures needs to have a very clear-cut economic link. Where does it lead to? How does it lead to good governance? Why would a foreign investor believe today standing in December, he or she is in a better position to invest than it was in July? So these are very simple questions we have to answer. Then also our tax system, as you know, is many other developing countries quite fractured. Our tax GDP ratio is one of the lowest in the world. The caretaker government, I hope, does some concrete job which will hope recover internal revenue generation. We need to make our export more diversified. I'll be very honest with you. This whole gloating of Bangladesh on RMG, I've been one of those who have been a strong critic. If a country's 80% export comes from one sector, This is a bad signal. We need to diversify. This is the time. We have agro processing, we have IT. So this is where we need to move on. Second, this low wage paid value addition R&D, we need to move on. Those are my initial comments. But I'm sure in the uh, session where we'll interact with other panel, I'll be happy to more chip in more. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Munir, for your insights on that. And thank you also for starting off with that intergenerational advice. Today, just as I was walking here, where I saw some euphoria in some quarters around what's happening in Syria as well, with the removal of another um, dictator, oppressor. Some were also cautioning, like yourself, as to what will follow, what will come. So yeah, thank you for that word of caution. I'd like to move on now to Dr. Cynthia Farid. Dr. Cynthia, you are a, prominent legal historian and lawyer, advocate of the Supreme Court of Bangladesh, also shuttling between Hong Kong and Dhaka. Um, and you have significant expertise in Bangladesh's constitutional and administrative systems and law. What urgent legal and constitutional reforms are necessary to preserve the democratic aspirations, the human rights aspirations, the transparency aspirations, the anti corruption hopes that the student led movement, which was also a broader coalition, I must add, led by the students? What legal or constitutional reforms are necessary today?
Thank you. Great question. Big question. I think some context is necessary in this regard. I think what's happening right now, we're going through a profound constitutional moment. And it's the debate is understandably raging whether we need constitutional changes. Do we make amendments? Do we completely get rid of the Constitution, right? So this debate is understandable in the context of what's happened. But look, drafting or changing a constitution, it's easy. You put 5 lawyers in a room, you can come up with a draft, no problem. The issue is consensus on what needs to change. I think we know what we're against, right? And that's been clear. We know we're against authoritarianism. We know we're against despotism. Question is, what are we for? And I feel like that question has not been under discussion all that much. Because I delve into legal history, I tend to look at things both during and beyond constitutions. And so if you look at South Asian constitutions, and I think indeed in global South contexts, these constitutions are relatively new documents. They sit on top of legal and economic systems which predate these constitutions. So a lot of these systems have embedded structural injustice, which if you bring a new constitution, it may not necessarily address those structural injustices. And therefore, rights alone without democracy could mean very little in practice. So the question is, do we chase privileges where we enable different groups to come to power and become the ruling class? Or do we design a system where we want parity in distribution of rights and privileges? So look, it's very easy to say, wipe the slate clean, bring a new document, but we need to be pragmatic. And I think if you look at the example of Egypt, 3 elections, 2.5 years later, voter participation went straight down. Chile mulled over a constitution, very progressive constitutional draft. Referendum didn't succeed, it was rejected. And so in the interim, political and economic instability is very real, and 170, 80 million people, the ability to withstand, sustain instability, the margin of error is very little, I'm afraid. So form of government is not our problem. I think over 53 years, we've tried 12 different kinds of systems of government, parliamentary system, presidential system, what have you. And so if you look at the Sri Lankan crisis in 2022, and just recently, just a few weeks ago in South Korea, political elites agreed on operating within a constitutional framework. They didn't throw out the baby with the bathwater, as the saying goes. So in the short term, I think we need to agree on a number of things, the first of which is a framework for transition, some sort of an electoral roadmap. Secondly, low-hanging fruits. which are, I think right now, judicial reforms should be front and center. And you could do some of those without a parliament, without a constitutional amendment, at least some of those reforms, if not all. So independent judiciary is essential. We don't have an independent prosecution service. That is essential. So if people are on trial from the old regime for complicity in human rights violations, if these trials fall apart because of legal process, they're going to come back with more impunity in the future. And thirdly, and finally, my final point is that we need to de-escalate tension with our neighbors, right? And so we may not have a perfect constitution. And if you look at South Asian constitutions, most of them they insist on a sort of majoritarian social contract, right? Where minorities don't have a lot of protection. But Bangladesh, in its 53 years, it's not the country where, with antecedents of pogroms against its minorities, right? And so I just want to finish with something that the Indian Foreign Minister, Minister Jaishankar, said yesterday, which was that regional tensions anywhere is concerning. No region is too far away. And I'm almost quoting verbatim. So I'm sure that the Bangladeshi government will be ready to assist him in finding his way back to the region closer to home. And so I think diplomacy, perhaps even third party mediation, might be the answer in this case. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. And diplomacy and third-party mediation are exactly what the Doha Forum stands for. As we can see, with all the hustling and shuttling of different things happening around the world in the Middle East. I'd like now to turn over to Professor Naomi Hussain, who is a professor at SOAS at the University of London. You're a political sociologist. A lot of your research work has focused on how individuals in poverty access public services. Question that I'd like to address you is on, given the interplay between governance and economic stability, which democratic reforms do you consider vital for sustaining economic growth amidst all this political turmoil, but without compromising social equity?
Thanks. These are really, really big questions. So, give me a moment or two. I also want to say thank you to the Jagoran Foundation for getting Bangladesh on the Doha Forum agenda. It's rare that we have these opportunities to speak on an international stage about Bangladesh. Despite being the 8th biggest nation in the world, we do tend to punch below our weight. We're hoping that's really going to change. I think my fellow panelists have also kicked off with some really, really useful starting points here. And one thing I think is really important to note about Bangladesh is you just cannot separate democratization from inclusive development. It's never been the case. Historically, all of our struggles for democracy have been underpinned very, very closely by struggles also for economic development, for fairer economic systems. And this is why the constitution is as it is. It is why, as Professor Munir also mentioned, we have had the sorts of struggles that we've had. So inclusive development and democratization, political systems have always gone together in Bangladesh. And we saw that very much in this last moment, in this last movement. We had a period of concentration of political power, which was bought and paid for by grand corruption on an incredible scale. Something like $16 billion a year, apparently, according to the new white paper, have been siphoned out of the country in one way or another, stolen by rich people who now go around in yachts and have Mayfair penthouses. That's $16 billion a year is from a GDP of, what is it, 450 billion in total? I mean, it's a vast, vast proportion of the country's wealth. So political corruption and democratization, both of them are very closely connected to the way the economy is distributed. And I think it's true to say also that development did happen in Bangladesh. Without a doubt, it happened. Whether it happened because of or despite the Awami League in power, I think is a question that remains to be explored. But it's also true that the middle classes were very much left behind, and looking at certain government servants flying around in helicopters while they were struggling to make basic ends meet, trying to afford rental properties in the big cities in Dhaka was not a good feeling, and no doubt helped to spark the protests. But in particular, the inflation, the cost of living crisis is affecting everyone in Bangladesh. So what can be done? Well, first of all, of course, the general democratic reforms that we need. We need to have parties that swap power. We can't just have the one forever and ever, because they get too comfortable and they don't feel that they need to listen to what anyone's concerns are. So we have to do that, and that's not easy. Democracy is not easy. It requires hard work. But the government needs to be able to hear people's concerns. One way of bringing that about is to invest very much in. So we hear a lot about political parties, about democracy being the swapping of political parties. We go from one to another. That's just not going to be enough. It's just not going to be enough. We can have the opposition party in power after the next election, and unless we reform the system, as Sajid and as Cynthia have said, unless we reform the system, we're going to end up with the same concentration of power once again. So one of the things that we must do is reopen and strengthen the civic space. We need to have space for citizen-led organizations to do all kinds of things, not only to recreate a free press, not only to recreate the civil society organizations that monitor public spending and procurement and all that, but also to make sure that those organizations are available to monitor the IMF reforms that are happening, to monitor procurement, and to monitor energy deals. These big energy deals have been an important source of corruption. The last thing I want to say about democratization, and this is very unpopular and it's also quite unfashionable, we really, really need to support labor reforms. We really need to support the strengthening, the building of proper, real trade unions in Bangladesh. And as you said, the concentration of the export sector in garments industry has led to this incredible political power of garments industry owners in Bangladesh. This is no good. The workers are the people that actually build the deliver the export growth, but have very few rights, can barely eat on what they're being paid. Bangladeshi garments workers are paid the lowest in the region, and it's one of the reasons why we linger at the very bottom of the global value chain. So, but it's not only garments workers; it's also migrants working in countries like Qatar, who have very few rights, who have very few protections. These rights and protections are essential. They're also a very, very important part of democracy building. No country in the world has had a robust democracy without having proper, sound, legal trade unions.
Thank you, Professor Naomi, for those thoughts, especially on the labor reforms and what's required in terms of legislative frameworks to protect the rights of laborers and workers. I'd now like to turn my attention to Your Excellency, Dr. Khalilur Rahman. Thank you, first of all, for being with us at such short notice. I know that last week you weren't aware that you'd be here with us at Doha, so it's a pleasure and honor to have you here. Um, with your extensive background in the Bangladesh Foreign Service, where you have recently been appointed as the High Representative or the Chief Advisor on Rohingya and priority issues. Did I get that right? Okay,
You got
thank
it
you.
right.
This is quite a long title. One of your key roles is to further, I would assume, Bangladesh's international engagement and diplomacy. I'd like to sort of bring the question back and ask you how you see and how you assess the interim government rising up to the challenges, both domestic and international. What is your assessment of that? And given your role specifically on the Rohingya crisis and the refugees in Bangladesh, are we to witness a significant shift in Bangladesh's foreign policy, and also alluding to perhaps Cynthia's um, remark around our neighbors and friendly relations? So, are we to see a shift in Bangladesh's foreign policy? And how do you assess? I know you've been recently appointed, but how do you assess the performance of the interim government in both facing domestic and international challenges? Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. First of all, I will thank the organizers of Doha Forum for having Bangladesh topic for the first time in 22 years. And Jaguar Foundation worked very hard for that. So kudos to you. Although I'm High Representative of the Chief Advisor, here I'll be my own representative and would speak as a citizen. That's how probably we do good dialogue. It's probably too early to assess progress poor performance of the interim government. In any school, you got to give the kid about a semester to do that. So I would suggest that give us a little bit more time. Ours was baptism by fire. We got into the government when there was no government. We inherited a situation which, there was no government for a few days. And prior to that, Sajid, I celebrate your heroism. They fought so hard on the street without any weapon. This was a complete peaceful movement that brought down, I would say, arguably the most authoritarian regime that we have seen, that killed or maimed thousands of its own young people, including 6-year-old kids. Okay. When I took up my job, the first thing I did was to go to the hospital where the wounded kids are there. There was an 11-year-old kid, and I asked him, "You went to the streets?" He said, "If need be, I'll go again." If you look at the X-ray films, you will see hundreds of bullet pellets in their feet, hand, and a few in the head. So still, they are hopeful. They will do it again. So this is the best guarantee that we have for future. Best. Now, the whole thing is about where do we go from here? And for that, I'd reflect a little bit on where we came from. I'm arguably the oldest person here in this room, at least oldest Bangladeshi, and I've seen quite a bit. Okay. Now, some generations ago, we all were, with a few exceptions, our forefathers were all sharecroppers. They worked under British imperialism, which designated a few landlords to expropriate all the lands and then employ our forefathers as sharecroppers. So Brits took their share. The land owners, they took their share. And whatever meager that we had, we had to live with that. And whenever disaster struck, they took their share. We were left with nothing, and we ended up getting money from usurers who would charge tremendous amount of interest. And next year, if we cannot pay that, we'd be kicked out our homestead and we become destitutes. Okay, so that's where we came from. Let's not forget that. So with the establishment of Dhaka University in the early part of last century, we saw a gradual emergence of a small middle class. But they didn't see a future in front of them. My own grandfather's brother stood first in Bengal civil service, but he could not sit for Indian civil service because he was a Bengali Muslim. He resented that all his life. So they created Pakistan. Pakistan didn't fulfill our aspirations. So the roadblock they removed by removing the Brits, removing the landlords, removing the moneylenders, did not give them a way forward. So they removed the roadblock called Pakistan. And then we had our own country. Successively, you mentioned, you were a fighter that removed roadblocks that was put in front of you by Ershad, right? And now you have removed the biggest that I have seen. We say that all our generations in the past century, one after the other, we fought very valiantly to remove roadblocks. It also tells us a sad story that we have not been able to establish an order where we don't have to remove any roadblocks. There is no roadblock. Professor Yunus wrote a book that I always kept on my desk. Remove the roadblocks. Let people go ahead. Now, the gentleman has been charged with that responsibility. Okay. Now, a reform, and you will guarantee this. I'll die, but you'll be there. That a reform means reform when a poor rickshaw puller can dream, rickshaw puller's daughter can dream to become a doctor, and a ready-made garments worker who is not paid a living wage, her son can dream to be a prime minister of the country. When we can dream like this, only when we can dream like this, we'll say, okay, we have done a good job. This is our promise to the future. And I ask you to make sure that and push and push and push. Don't wait for us to do things. We will probably set a direction. We'll probably set a few things on the ground, but that will not be enough. You have to carry it forward. It's your job. Will not be there. So now remember that all of this is happening at a time when the global institutions don't function very well. I think they don't function in certain areas at all. You see more than 1 million people crossed over from Myanmar to Bangladesh, and they are there for 7 years. So 1.2 times 7 is nearly 9 million people that we have been feeding. That is exactly the number of people that crossed over to India in 1971. This is the order of magnitude. Don't forget this. That's what we have been doing. And we are not telling Rohingyas that, look, this is the favor we do to us. We do it because of goodness of heart. Okay. So that problem, you asked me, look, it was falling off the map. And Professor Yunus, he went to the General Assembly and really appealed to the conscience of the world. And in 2 months, we got an international conference by the United Nations on this very issue. And interestingly, 106 countries co-sponsored it, and it was passed by consensus. I've done about 12.5 General Assembly myself. I've never seen a conference passed during the middle of November. It goes all the way to the end of the assembly in December. So it shows that there is still a lot of political support for this issue. And we will use this conference as an opportunity to bring this issue back to life. It is a lot of hard work. We began the work. As I said, it was baptism by fire for me. But again, I owe it to these people, I owe it to my country, and I owe it to Sachin. And so the international institutions are not working. You're on your own. And our region is in a great deal of instability. The Indian External Affairs Minister alluded to that yesterday. Be mindful of that. We are operating in a situation where the external circumstances are not very favorable. So we are facing triple changes. Plus, as we trying to make a transition from dictatorship to democracy, we are not being helped by our neighbor who claims itself to be the largest democracy of the world. I'll not say much about it because our foreign secretaries are meeting tomorrow on the 10th, I guess, the after. And we'd like this to be an opportunity to bring the relationship to a good level so that we can work together. So I'm not going to prejudge that and say anything about it at this stage. But I say, we'll not go back to where it was before. We're not going to have a tryst with devil, which promises us to take to heaven, because we know is going to lead us to hell. We don't want to be there again. Never again. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Dr. Khalil Rahman. I've been told that we have 40 seconds left, so we've done very well with the opening sort of remarks. I think, do we have time for any questions from? We don't. No. Okay. So I've been vetoed. Look, I'm here as a guest of the host, so we have to abide by their. But just to finish off on a point, because here I had a lot of discussion around hope, destiny, willpower, intergenerational advice, and it reminded me of an Arab scholar and sage who actually, when discussing destiny, speaks about the fact that we should not submit to destiny. لا نستسلم للقدر نحارب القدر بالقدر. We fight one destiny with another destiny. And this is what I see the Bangladeshi youth, the Bangladeshi population, the Bangladesh civil society, both abroad and in Bangladesh, trying to fight their destiny with another destiny. We hope the best for that evolution, revolution, movement that Sajid and his friends and his colleagues and his generation have initiated, but hopefully with the advice and guidance and mentorship of others like Professor Munir and Professor Naomi and of course His Excellency Dr. Khalil Rahman. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for attending. Thank you for your support. My apologies we couldn't take questions. I'd like to thank all our panelists. Four of them flew in from actually, all of them flew in from Bangladesh, actually, apart from Professor Naomi, who flew in from the UK. So I'd like to thank them all. I'd like to thank the organizers. I'd like to thank also the ambassador, the Bangladeshi ambassador to Qatar, who is also here with us. I'd like to thank Doha Forum. We actually had the Minister of Education sit in for some of the sessions, part of the session, Her Excellency Lulu Al Khatir. I'd like to thank her for attending and for all of you for being here. My apologies for not being able to take your questions, but we're all here. The panelists are all here, and we're more than fit and available to speak to you all. Thank you very much once again. Thank you.